Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now you've unmuted yourself.
Wonderful. Yes, I am working on streaming this to Facebook so my congregants can check it out whenever they want. So we'll see if that works. Hopefully we have some people joining us. All right. Wonderful. Thank you for joining, and a little early.
Yeah, hi, I'm
Little early by Jewish lights, of course.
yes, I'm Marty Coburn from Temple Beth David in Cheshire, Connecticut.
Lovely to meet you, sir.
Hi,
Hello.
I'm Myra Soifer from Reno, Nevada.
How are you?
Good, how are you? Shavuot
I'm
tov.
good.
Good.
Shavuot tovot.
Yes,
We have probably crossed paths at a CCAR or something, I'm sure.
Maybe, I'm an old foop, so maybe not.
Oh, surely not.
And I've been out of the country for a few years, so I haven't done
Ah.
CCARs in a bit, but
Where were you?
I was in the Peace Corps in Panama.
Oh my. Well, that's.
Yeah, till we all got
Quite something.
evacuated, of course.
Oh, well, yes, there is that.
There
Of
was
course.
that. There was this little virus going around, apparently.
So I'm told.
Yeah, so we've heard.
so Rabbi Emanuel, what temple are you in?
I am at Congregation Beth Israel in Corpus Christi, Texas.
Corpus Christi.
And there is one of my congregants. There we go. Give me 1 second. I realize that.
I've been to Corpus Christi.
Okay. All right. Hey, Linda, long time no see. All right. Okay.
The flock is
Obviously,
gathered.
we'll give people a little while to join. And as people join, just so you know, this is also going to be streaming on my congregation's Facebook page. So hope that's okay with everyone. All righty. So while we're waiting for people to join us, because obviously Jewish time, if you want to share a little bit in the chat, say a little bit about who you are, would love to hear. Or just not in the chat, just say hi.
Sandy Meltzer from Worcester, Massachusetts.
From where?
Hi, Sandy Meltzer from Worcester, Massachusetts.
I was born there.
Worcester, Massachusetts.
Yes, I was born there.
No,
I was born in Worcester, yes.
really? Who
I
were your
was. I mean,
parents?
I moved very early. I moved about a month later to Huntsville, Alabama, and then 5 years after that to England. But I was born in Worcester, Massachusetts. So my parents tell me.
Wow, that's exciting.
There you go.
Okay, what were your parents' names?
Charles and Padut Emanuel.
No, Rabbi, you've lost your accent anyway.
It comes back. It goes in and out. As my congregants will tell you, and I have two of them online right here. It depends on the context.
Yeah, I had it. My company had a base in Scotland, and I had a Scottish employee who worked for me, and you'd hardly tell he had an accent until he got on the phone with someone from Scotland, and then
Right.
all of a sudden you couldn't understand a word he was saying.
Well, I'd like to think I'm a little more comprehensible than that, but all right. We'll give people a few more minutes, a couple more minutes, and then looks like we've got people joining us, which is marvelous. Hopefully, we will have a lovely conversation.
Oh, we got a minion already.
Sorry?
We've got a minion already.
We have a minion here. There you go. Well, also let's, while this is not technically Torah study, it is study that is in the larger realm of Torah. So let's do the Torah, the blessing for studying Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. As we bless God for the mitzvah and the opportunity to engage and struggle and embrace the study of Torah, which actually is, quite apt for what we're about to discuss. So, I think we can get started, and I want to thank everyone for joining me tonight and joining in this entire wonderful evening of study. I will say it's been a tough year. This is one of the silver linings of the last year, is that we have found this wonderful technology, which, while most of us are in many ways abundantly tired of, it does provide some really wonderful opportunities such as this, which people in smaller congregations, particularly smaller congregations like mine that are far flung, we're in Corpus Christi, Texas, allows the opportunity to join with people from all around the country to really engage in this way. So this is wonderful. Now, as I said, it's been an interesting year. It's been an interesting few years, to be honest. And one of the things that keeps coming back for me again and again is the question of really the question of how do we engage with each other civilly over questions and the search for truth that seems to have become so complicated, difficult, challenging over the course of the past few years, and frankly, if we were paying attention, a long time before. And there's a phrase that comes up again and again in Jewish tradition, and we're going to go through the origins of that phrase and the meaning of that phrase in various texts from Pirkei Avot and Talmud and Torah, etc., primarily working around some stuff from Pirkei Avot and a very famous Talmudic story about Hillel and Shammai. And what I hope we can do is find some guidance in Judaism into how to engage in the search for truth, debates about what is and what is not true, and debates about the direction of our lives, the direction of our country, the direction of our religion, the direction of our communities and our cities and our families, that seem to be so challenging, not just now, but in many cases always, which is why, of course, this is ancient wisdom and not something that just turned up in the internet age. So I'm going to start sharing. Oh, and we have some people saying some stuff on the, oh, wonderful. Oh, wow, we have someone from McAllen. Wonderful. Only two, just down the road, only 2.5 hours. Only in Texas and maybe California can you say such a thing. But all right. So let me share this. I have a little slideshow. Hopefully it will all work. There we go. So there we go. Wonderful. The glories of technology. So as I said, I titled this Arguing for the Sake of Heaven, the Ancient Rabbi's Secrets for Getting Along Even When You Don't Agree on Anything. And I should tell you just before we start that, first of all, my congregation is, as I said, it's in Corpus Christi, Texas. It's somewhat, it's remote from larger Jewish communities. We are not only 2.5 hours from McAllen, Texas, where the closest large Jewish community is San Antonio. And as many of you may or may not know, when you are not in the larger cities, congregations tend to be less clearly in one direction or another in terms of political and cultural discussion. And so this has been obviously in the past few years, a particular interest and something that has been at the forefront of my mind in my community and generally. I should also say that I'm not sharing the. I always find it fascinating when people share a TED talk, or they do they write a self-help book, and essentially what they're saying is, this is something that is easy for me, and I'm going to write and I'm going to tell you how it should be easy for you. Well, the truth is, I am not giving this discussion from the perspective of this is easy, but rather from the perspective of this is something that is a constant challenge, how to really have proper civil substantive discussions in such a divisive age. It's not easy. And I'd like to think that the rabbis have some insights as to how to do this more effectively. So let's start with really the foundation of this discussion. So in Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the ancestors, it says, every argument that is for the sake of heaven's name is destined to endure. But if it is not for the sake of heaven, then it is not destined to endure. And then they continue to say, okay, well, what, they assume that you're like, okay, that's great. What is an argument for the sake of heaven, and what is an argument not for the sake of heaven? I need more information. And so the rabbis often, rather than just explain and describe, what they do is they share an example. And so the example of an argument for the sake of heaven is the argument between Hillel and Shammai, and we're going to get to more details about that in a minute. And what is an example of an argument not for the sake of heaven? The argument of Korach and his congregation. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, Meiri, a medieval commentator, breaks it down a little more for us. The argument between Hillel and Shammai, in their debates, one of them would render a decision and the other would argue against it out of a desire to discover the truth, and not out of a cantankerous or not out of a cantankerousness or wow, that word is hard. Cantankerousness. There you go. Or a wish to prevail over his fellow. An argument not for the sake of heaven was that of Korach and his company, for they came to undermine Moses, our master, may he rest in peace, and his position out of envy and contentiousness and ambition for victory. So the short explanation here is that the argument between Hillel and Shammai, which said we're going to go into more detail in a minute to see exactly what they're talking about, is one in which they would go back and forth. Someone would render a decision, then they would argue against it. But the important thing, and I think the real key here, is that it was an argument that was out of the desire to discover truth, and not out of a desire to prevail in the argument or to win the argument, right? And an argument not for the sake of heaven was essentially the opposite. An argument like Korach, who rebelled against Moses, that was intended for the purpose of envy, of contentiousness, of a desire for victory, of ambition. It was not intended to get to a fuller result or a better world. It was intended, you lose, I win, right? Now, and I don't know how many of you remember, but first of all, just if you have questions, just sort of, raise your hands in the chat, or just sort of unmute yourselves and interrupt. I don't mind at all. But I don't know how many of you remember, I think it was in 2004, there was it is now a famous debate, or not debate really, that was on a show called, because of course it was on cable news, Crossfire. And it had a liberal and a conservative, and I believe the conservative was Tucker Carlson, who is still around. And basically they would shout at each other, and they would get guests on to shout at each other. And Jon Stewart, formerly of The Daily Show, went on and essentially said, look, I'm a comedian and I know this is wrong. Stop hurting America. Stop having an argument like Korach. And so at the core of this is the idea that what it means to have an argument for the sake of heaven is to have an argument that is intended to actually get at truth, at substance, and not intended to simply defeat the other side, shut them up, bully them, or just win regardless of how things work out. So, as I said, if anybody wants to interrupt or ask questions, that is fine. Now we get to the core of it. So this is the actual discussion in the Talmud about this famous argument between Hillel and Shammai, or rather, more specifically, between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. And just to explain what this means, these are the schools of these particular rabbis. So imagine in modern terms, in a modern legal context, if Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia had left legal law schools in their names that taught their philosophies, right? So Hillel and Shammai disagreed on pretty much everything. And their philosophical school of Jewish law was completely at odds. They saw the world completely differently. They made decisions that were at odds, etc. And they disagreed for 3 years. One assumes they disagreed for much longer than that, but the idea is that they disagreed for 3 years until something happened to resolve the argument. So what would happen is one side would say, the halacha is according to our opinion. And the other one say, no, you're wrong. The halacha is according to our opinion. And ultimately, it appears that God got so annoyed by hearing this argument that a divine voice comes down and proclaims both these and those are the words of the living God. And let's break down what that means. What that means is, essentially, in the gloriously rabbinic sense, you're both right. Which leads to a problem. Which is, let's go back to the comparison here with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia. How can they both be right? I mean, they completely disagree. One is saying the sky is blue, and the other is saying, no, it isn't, and you're insane, right? That there is no, there appears to be, on the surface, how can these two philosophies, where they come up with such completely different viewpoints, how can they both be right? And what it really points to, at least what I will argue it points to, is the idea that perhaps can be best expressed by the old Monty Python line from Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. God, you are so very big, so absolutely huge. And the reality that the words of God, truth, purpose, and meaning are not merely contained in the viewpoints of one philosophy, one political party, one religion, or anything else. That essentially there is a much larger truth than we tend to know, and that what was happening with the school of Hillel and Shammai was that while they, in one sense, were completely disagreeing, what they were actually doing was perceiving specific parts of a much larger whole. The most common description of this, the metaphor for this, is the metaphor of the elephant and the blindfolded people, where you have an elephant and a group of blindfolded people, each of whom is basically told to hold on to one part of the elephant, and then told to describe what they're experiencing. And so, of course, the person who is blindfolded and holding onto the leg is going to describe something very different than the person who's blindfolded and holding onto the tail or the trunk or the tusks. And yet they are all describing truthfully and accurately a part of the larger animal. And if they could but see that larger animal, they would go, oh, I see how this connects to this. We're actually all talking the same thing. Great. What the idea here of Hillel and Shammai is, therefore, is the idea that if we really want to get to truth, if we really want to get to understand what God wants of us, we actually have to have the humility to understand that our perspective, our narrative, our bubble is only part of the picture. And a lot of it comes down to perspective. Some of you may have seen on Facebook a meme, a cartoon where there's two people on either side of a number. And depending on which side they're looking at, it's either 6 or 9. And essentially, they're both arguing, well, it's 6, it's 9. And of course, the idea is, well, actually, they're both right, because it really depends on which side you're looking at it from. Now, here's where things get even more interesting, though. Because at the end of all this, having said these and these are both the words of the living God, it then says, but the halacha, the law, goes according to Hillel, which also begs the question, well, wait a second. If both their words are the words of the living God, why is it that it goes to Hillel? Was it a coin toss? Nope, not at all. The reason is that they were agreeable and forbearing, showing restraint when affronted, and when they taught the halacha, they would teach both their own statements and the statements of Bet Shammai. Moreover, when they formulated their teachings and cited a dispute, they prioritized the statements of Bet Shammai to their own statements in deference to Bet Shammai. So what it's saying is this: an argument for the sake of heaven is one in which, one, you recognize that what you are arguing about, what you are proposing, is from your perspective, and there is a larger truth. And the purpose of the debate is to find that larger truth, and you do so by recognizing the other person, what the other person is saying, and not only giving them respect, but I think more importantly, although that is important, factoring in what they are saying, their viewpoints, into your arguments, into what you eventually decide. So, for instance, so essentially, how many people know or are, I mean, for all I know, people that basically only watch really one news source? They only watch Fox News. They only listen to NPR. They only watch MSNBC. They only read the New York Times. They only read the Wall Street Journal, whatever it might be. Or they only listen to Ben Shapiro, right? What it's saying is, if you're only listening to one set of arguments and not taking into account all of these other perspectives, then your argument, not only is your argument not for the sake of heaven, but it is not going to achieve the real point here, which is finding the truth. And doing so in a way, and I think more importantly, doing so in a way that does not result in the tearing of society. So I'll take a small break if anybody has any questions or any comments. All righty then. I'm either being astoundingly clear or people just are on bated breath to hear more. Good.
No, I'll speak up. I think
Yes.
that's it seems very topical. Certainly, the idea that argument, have we lost our ability to state our case and actually have a disagreement?
Yeah.
When you talk about Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and just the lessons that we learned about their relationship, you couldn't, diametrically opposed philosophies about everything, and in the meantime, the respect that they had for each other and the friendship that they had with each other, and what a message that's been. And we look at things, I mean, it's hard not to look at things now and say, can we see a relationship like that existing, certainly with our Supreme Court today, and certainly as it extends to so many things beyond. Where I feel about from my own my perspectives of whatever what mine are and my news sources, and when I try to see things that are a different way from mine, it's hard not to feel like I'm not getting a disagreement, I'm getting a vitriol.
Right.
So
And
where do
I
we
should
go
say, by
from
the
here?
way, you actually I couldn't have paid you to say you actually get me to the next slide, which was wonderful. Which is that the conclusion of the whole thing is that Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel disagreed on all these issues, but they behaved with love and friendship towards one another. And actually, according to another source, they were willing to be married to each other. Which, by the way, I don't know if people know that. I don't know the precise statistics, but between like the 50s and now, the amount of people who say that they could not possibly marry someone of the other political party has increased immensely. I mean, it used to be that most people were like, sure, what's the problem? Now, the majority of people will not marry someone or will not consider marrying someone of the opposite political party. It's just completely out of their perspective. But you're absolutely right. And I think that we'll get back to that. That aspect of relationship is incredibly important. And we'll get to that. I'll go more into that in a minute. But first, let me hear what Martin has to say.
I'm a nuclear physicist by training, so I tend to regard, facts, experimental measurements as fundamental. You could have different theories to explain the measurements, but if you observe something, it is what it is. And I think today we've seen certain parties just refuse to accept the evidence of their own eyes and ears and what's in front of them, which makes it hard to conduct a respectful argument. But I could still do it. I have several cousins, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your relatives, who are ardent Trump supporters. And there are two of them with whom I can have a discussion, a civil discussion. And there are two others who, if I even mention anything approaching the subject, will basically just explode. So, these are difficult times. I don't think we're going to see justices like Scalia and Ginsburg again. There's still a few such relationships in the Senate, and President Biden still has a similar relationship with some of his former Republican colleagues. But it is getting rarer and rarer, particularly as you mentioned, our media have become so fragmented and siloed, so to speak.
No, I think you raise an interesting. Thank you very much. I think you raise an important point and something that should be clarified, which is when I say that truth is big and multifaceted, that doesn't mean that there isn't truth. And I think that's where things get really challenging. Is of course there are some things that are true and not true, but there's also a lot of things where no one group actually has the entirety of the truth, and a lot really does depend on the perspective from which you're looking at it from. I remember we had a discussion in our local city council about a panhandling ordinance, an anti-panhandling ordinance, and a group of clergy had gotten together, basically saying, "Look, we're not sure this is a good idea. We feel that this isn't really solving the problem, and we need better solutions, etc." And one person, and somebody stood up and basically said, "Look, I work with a lot of people in this area, and I know that, and I believe half of the people who are dealing with this, who are panhandling, don't really need it, and so I think we shouldn't do this. Therefore, I think we do need this panhandling ordinance." And then one of my clergy friends came up and says, "I agree. I think that half of the people who are doing this don't really mean it. But therefore, I think we should, because half is enough." So they weren't even disagreeing on the facts. It was how you deal with the facts and which perspective you were coming at it from. And also, I think, and this is something which, I'm not going to go into much of this tonight, but it's an important perspective. I don't know how many of you have heard of the work of Jonathan Haidt and the Righteous Mind. The short version is he's a social psychologist, and basically his theory, which has become much more significant in the past decade, is the idea that, and I think it's based on some stuff from Daniel Kahneman, etc., that essentially how we decide politics, morality, ethics, etc., a lot of it has to do with effectively moral taste buds. Culturally, genetically, whatever, we're born and raised with certain things where we just prioritize certain values over others. So the difference between someone who prioritizes kindness over law and order, the difference with somebody who prioritizes fairness in the sense of nobody gets left behind versus fairness versus the people who really deserve it get more, right? These are different ways, and when we and because of these taste buds, we effectively create narratives that then get reinforced the more information comes in, which is one of the reasons why essentially and I think why the idea of argument for the sake of heaven is so important. It's one of the reasons why so many people do, in fact, essentially default to their own perspective and not really wanting to see the other person's perspective, because we're actually wired that way. We're wired to get essentially a dopamine hit when we hear something that agrees with us, and to really not like it when we hear something that doesn't. And part of what I think has been particularly significant about thinking about arguments for the sake of heaven is, in a way, the idea of how to get beyond that and work around it. So, any other thoughts before we continue? And thank you for those thoughts. All right. So this actually brings, so I think, going back to the question of the relationship, I think this is really one of the big issues. And I will here give, I'll share a little, so in a second, after a bit of Torah commentary, I'll share a little about some of my experiences in my own congregation. So this is from the Torah. It says, when you see the donkey of your enemy lying under its burden, and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it with them. And the imagery it's presenting here is essentially, you're walking by the side of the road. A guy you can't stand is, a guy you can't stand. Oh, by the way, apparently there is an Antonin Scalia law school. Good to know. Anyway, so a guy you cannot stand is there, and his donkey is lying at the side of the road. And what it's assuming is that your natural instinct would be to go, ha, serves him right, and keep moving. And instead, the commentaries on it, and I wasn't able to get all of the commentaries, but just to summarize, the commentaries on it say, look, this is why the Torah tells you to raise the donkey anyway. One, because it's not the donkey's fault, right? It's the donkey didn't do the nasty thing to you that you've never forgiven Bob for. The donkey's just a poor donkey. And I think that, by the way, is an important element, which is that we tend to forget that when we're arguing about all these things, there are actual real issues that don't get solved, right? How many times have awful things happened, and people go, we must do something about it, and then it just goes right back into the same cultural, political, vicious cycles, and nothing happens, because we forget that there's a donkey lying at the side of the road, and just worry about, let me get one more hit on this guy who I can't stand. Now, more importantly, though, I think that's important, but more importantly, though, the commentaries continue, and they imagine a scenario. And that scenario is, you go, you help the guy with the donkey. And while you're doing it, you have to talk, right? You have to have a discussion. And so you talk to this guy you don't like, okay? And you start, communicating. And then you start going, you know what, maybe this guy isn't so bad. Maybe this person is actually quite nice, because you're dealing with something where you have a common cause and a common thing to deal with. And through that thing, through that relationship, and through the understanding that you have something in common to do and to solve, you end up actually creating a relationship that means that you go beyond the hatred and the enmity. And I should say, as I said, my congregation is very much split down the middle. We have people who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, and we have people who voted for Trump. And I would say that, generally the cultural political divides are pretty much split, more or less. And yet none of that matters when we're all in the kitchen cooking for Food Fest. Or this morning, where we're all together preparing food for our drive-through free Jewish freezer sale for a fundraiser that we're doing. And none of it matters when we're all together praying. So, in a sense, therefore, that's the donkey. That's the, when we join together to do those things, we're able to go beyond that. and create those relationships like Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg of blessed memory, and go beyond these things and allow us, therefore, to have arguments for the sake of heaven. Because, and this is something that we all know. I mean, well, maybe we don't all know. I don't know how many people are active on Facebook or other social media. I know I am astoundingly active on Facebook. I know it's bad for me, but but one of the things that's a challenge on social media, and social media I think is a very significant part of all of this, is it's anonymous. Or even if it's not anonymous, you're arguing with somebody who you don't see, you may not know, they're not right there in front of you. And so you can end up in these awful, horrible arguments in which you say awful, horrible things that you would never say to someone that's right in front of you. Now, of course, there are people who would say awful things to people right in front of them, but most of us, I would like to think, are not those people. And yet, once we're online, we have a tendency to say things we wouldn't say to someone face to face because we don't have that relationship. So, all right. And I said, just a reminder, if anybody has questions, oh, 1 second. Oh dear. It is not moving. Huh. Well, that's frustrating. Give me a second. Let me see if I can. Okay, let me see if I can redo that. Huh. This seems to have frozen, which is unfortunate. But it's okay. What I'm going to be going on to now doesn't necessarily, I mean, I have the...
You could try stopping the share and then restarting.
1 second.
Was thinking
Yeah,
the same thing.
I did try. Well, okay, I'll stop the share, and then I will
that works or it
restart it.
doesn't. Who knows?
So yeah, somebody I once heard somewhere, to err is human, to truly mess up requires a computer.
Right.
There we go. Okay. Well, the good news is I have it up there. The bad news is it doesn't seem to want to start the slideshow again. But okay, I guess we'll just do that. All right. So let me go back to Pirkei Avot, because there's some elements here that I think add to this, and I want to sort of add into the discussion. The first is that the first line of Pirkei Avot talks about the transmission of Torah, and then says, be patient and deliberate in judgment, which I think at the end of the day is one of the biggest questions here. We are in a society which tends to be very everything right here, right now. We have email, we have text, we have Twitter. People expect. I remember, when before I was a rabbi, I was a lawyer, and back in the early 90s, and I remember the older lawyers were absolutely bemoaning the invention of the fax machine, because it meant that they could immediately send information to people, but then information could be immediately sent to them. But also it meant that people expected them to return things immediately and have an immediate response. And so one of the things that I think is important in having an argument for the sake of heaven is breathe. Stop, pause, be deliberate. Don't just go. Don't just go with your immediate response. Think about what it means. And in a sense, that last phrase there, make a fence around the Torah, is actually a good addition to that. The idea of making a fence around the Torah is the idea that a lot of halakha is far more expansive than it technically needs to be, because what they're doing essentially is saying, look, this is where we want to be, but we know that people have a tendency to push it. So we're going to put the halakha over here so you don't get here. And to some extent, when it comes to this, to having arguments for the sake of heaven, I think that's actually a rather important element. Be deliberate and create boundaries. Know where to go and not to go. Now, so Pirkei Avot 1:7, Nitai the Arbalite used to say, keep a distance from an evil neighbor, do not become attached to the wicked, and do not abandon faith in divine retribution. And what I take away from that is don't hang out with Twitter trolls. Or more importantly, more specifically, whether it's online, whether it's in your personal life or at work or in family, there are people who are conflict inciters. There are people who egg you on. There are people who basically say, you've got to do this, you've got to be more angry about this, you've got to... And sometimes those are great people to be with because they're passionate, and sometimes not so much. Know when to not listen and hang out with people who are going to push you into conflicts that you don't want to be in because they want you to be in that. David, were you saying something?
I'm mumbling it to myself, but
okay.
I'm with you.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I'm happy to hear it. All right. So I got a few more things to look at, and then if we have any questions at the end, and okay. This goes back to what I was saying before about really thinking outside your bubble. Do not act as a judge. Play the part of play the part of an advocate. Do not play the part of an advocate. Sorry, that was a weird translation there. When the litigants are standing before you, look upon them as if they were both guilty, and when they leave your presence, look upon them as if they were both innocent, and when they have accepted the judgment. And I think from that, what I get is, again, going back to this idea of not just in political and cultural terms, that we really have to really have an argument for the sake of heaven, one that is substantive and that brings about peace and harmony. The purpose is not to win. The purpose is to get at the truth. The purpose is not to keep going until the other side has given up. And perhaps even more importantly, the idea is be very critical, not just of the other side, but your own side when you're having the argument. And once the argument is done, be very compassionate and merciful of both of you. And Pirkei Avot 1:12, pursue peace and harmony. And I want to be clear here. A lot of people, when I say to them that, the purpose of an argument for the sake of heaven is to pursue peace and harmony, like, well, wait a second, how does that work? An argument is not peaceful or harmonious. That doesn't work. But the thing is that the purpose of an argument for the sake of heaven is to eventually get to peace and harmony. But to recognize that in order to get there, you may need to be challenging and uncomfortable and challenged. But again, the idea is to get to a point and to work towards a point where we get peace and harmony. So it does not mean conflict avoidance. It does not mean just giving up. It means, what are you trying to get at the end of the day? And the next one is, basically Shammai. And by the way, it's interesting, it's Shammai who says this, because Shammai was not that nice a person based on the descriptions we have. He used to say, make your study of the Torah a fixed practice, speak little and do much, and receive all people with a pleasant countenance. You'd be amazed how different people react to you when you're being nice and going, that's a really good idea. That's an interesting point. Let me hear what you have to say, rather than you're wrong and let's be honest. How many of us really react well to those videos where someone is haranguing someone in a grocery store, even if we agree with them. It's not a nice thing. It doesn't move things along. And I think the last two things here, which I'll take together, and then if we may have a few more minutes for questions if people want. Shimon, his son, used to say, "All my days I grew up among the sages, and I found nothing better for a person than silence." And the final thing is, Rabbi Tarfon used to say, "It's not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it." And both of those together, I think, in a way, I take that as what I call the Kenny Rogers gambler rule. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. We all have the ability to change others' minds. We do not have the ability to change everybody's minds. And sometimes it's important to know when to argue and when to not argue. We've all been in situations where in a relationship, or with family, with a partner, with friends, etc., co-workers, where this is not the time to bring something up because the other person is mad, is anxious, they're concerned about other things. This is not the time to start this argument. Sometimes it's good to be silent. And I think this last thing, it is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it. There's a lot of arguments that we're going to get into in our lives, personal, political, cultural, religious, just for fun. But it's not our duty to finish it. It's okay to walk away. It's okay to say, I'm going to not, an argument, it's okay to know that there are times when, to everything there is a season. And there are times when, if you push the argument, it will go from being an argument for the sake of heaven to one that is not for the sake of heaven because of the timing and the situation. And I think, I think we all have an opportunity, I hope, to learn from this ancient wisdom, to recognize how meaningful and significant it actually can still be. And I hope that I know I've learned from it, and whenever I have the temptation to get into an argument not for the sake of heaven, I think of this, and I hope that others can too. So, does anybody have any questions? Now, obviously, I know that there are other sessions, so whenever you need to get off for the next session. But I think we have like 5-10 minutes for argument, if not for arguments, for we can at this point I go into the other Monty Python thing, which is I want an argument. No, you don't. Yes, you do. If anybody knows that sketch.
Yes.
Oh yeah. So he said, a wise person once told me, you do not have to attend every argument to which you have been invited. Indeed, indeed, indeed. So any other questions or comments? Said we have a few minutes.
I spent 26 years in the Army Nurse Corps, and a lot of my supervisors I didn't agree with, but I had to respect them.
Well, that's fair. Absolutely.
You have to respect what people, even though you don't agree with them, you have to give them respect.
Absolutely.
I have a very simple question, actually. I just
Yes.
wanted to ask if it's possible for you to share the slides that you had. I found that very interesting, the particular pieces that you had along the way there. Where I was mumbling to myself is because there was a line from one of the first slides from Pirkei Avot about do not lose faith in in divine retribution.
Oh, well, yeah, right.
And I found that that really kind of hit me, fascinated me. And so that statement, or that piece within the three things, that one resonated with me in a way that I'm still coming to grips with.
Yeah, I mean, do not lose faith that eventually there will be consequences. Essentially, yeah. Okay, wonderful. Martin, you on?
No, I just wanted to say, I think it's an important topic, and it's getting harder and harder to make arguments for the sake of heaven these days. I mean, the overlap that you have with other people is just shrinking daily. And the other comment I would make is that things like Facebook are what Marshall McLuhan would call cool media. They don't have a lot of content. So there's no way to put nuance or anything into the, even with emojis. They invented emojis to try to warm it up a little, but they're not all that great. Whereas if we're having a conversation, you can tell from my posture, from my tone of voice, how serious I am. Am I being sarcastic? Am I smiling? So, to give you. Whereas you could get into an argument with someone on internet or on Facebook, it just explodes automatically. Quick example: I was at my local coffee shop, and there were two guys in our little town of Cheshire, sitting at the next table, wearing guns. And, I casually went up to them. So I'm just curious, why do you feel it's necessary for you to be packing firearms, And of course, the first answer was, well, of course, it's my right. But then we talked for like a half hour. And I could understand their point of view. They actually turned out were both gun instructors. One of them was in charge of the training program for the state police. And he made this argument that, you can't rely on the police. They're too slow. They have only one session a year at the firing range, so they're probably going to miss if they try to shoot, And, it ended up with them in offering me to come down and shoot at the firing range, although I gave them my number, but they never followed. I could not have had more than 2 lines of that conversation on Facebook or anywhere on the internet.
No.
Within 20 seconds, we would have been screaming, all caps, screaming at each other.
Absolutely.
But that's one of the reasons why these arguments are getting harder, because particularly now during the pandemic, we don't, we don't get a chance to meet face to face. On the other hand, at the same coffee shop, I have constant conversations with the guy who was a Tea Party guy and is now a raving Trumpist. I guess I don't want to be judgmental about it, but we could still have a conversation face to face. Online, forget it.
Well, I think, Martin, that's a really important point that you made, though. You had that conversation. And it doesn't mean that even it necessarily swayed your opinion, but you have a perspective of understanding the position of a person who is carrying that firearm, how they feel about it, why they feel about it, even if it differs from your own.
Right.
And how often do we even get to go in? I think I was in a meeting earlier this week, last week, actually, and where I actually went in with a conceived notion about a certain thing. I was leading this meeting. I brought up a topic, and where I heard there were 10 other people in the meeting, what I learned was the perspective I came in and an expectation I had flat out was so not what I expected to hear from this group of people. But the opportunity to be there and to have a conversation about it was, I got to rethink my own thinking about it. And it's the kind of thing that I want to know, that I want to feel that I'm open to it. And I want to feel that other people feel that way as well, that you can have a disagreement. The point of this discussion here, that the idea that an argument isn't for the sake of I have to win. It's, do you make progress in your thinking?
Okay, wonderful. Linda, did you have something you wanted to say, or?
Well,
it wasn't a question, but I guess I was thinking about a couple of
comments or
Okay.
things that jogged my thinking when I was hearing everything that's been said. One of them is that I think we all have biases and various lenses we look through, but there is something called fact check, and there's ability to use critical thinking and not just follow the leader. The other thoughts are that I think you have to kind of consider the source. In other words, kind of what you were saying about know when to hold them and when to fold them. If you're only there, if your whole point is to try to change somebody's thinking, and you can tell that they're basically entrenched, there is no point really, other than maybe feeling like I'm superior because you're an idiot. Other than that, there's no point because it's not going to do any good. If you feel like there's truly a give and take, or someone that's actually open-minded, or at least willing to consider other thoughts, then yeah, I can see where you could have a discussion. But I think there's emotional, there's logical, there's all kinds of ways people think, and sometimes they really are. You're talking like this when you're on two different levels. If you're trying to be practical and logical, and they are not thinking in that vein, then it's a waste to try to sway them, because they're not used. Your logical argument may be perfect, but it's not going to make a difference. And the other thing is that my own personal philosophy is, again, I'm a retired social worker, just to mention, but you try to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. You try to understand maybe where they're coming from, not to side with them, but are they angry because they've had, and I'm not making excuses for people being angry, but to take a minute to think, they're really not necessarily the enemy. They may think very differently, diametrically differently than you do, but the respect thing you mentioned, the whole thing is consider the source. You don't have to be swayed by it. You don't have to try to change your thinking. But at the same time, there may be some kind of reasons why they feel the way they do. And if it's not just because they've heard it 100 times on another channel or something, at least maybe hear them out, because I believe that sometimes it is beneficial to hear the other side, not just everyone that agrees with your side. So
I agree.
long story short, and I know that became sort of like lengthy, but I just feel like we're all sort of on this, in this group, it seems like we're all sort of like-minded in many ways. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I get the feeling that the fact that we're here at all,
Right.
it's not necessarily that different thinking, but I think it helps to try to think and listen to what everyone is saying, whether you agree with it or not, unless it literally is dangerous or something like that.
Absolutely. So people are heading to the next session, as they should. So I did put my my email in the chat. So David, if you want to check that and email me, I can send you the slides. And do you have it?
I got it. Thank you very
Good,
much.
perfect. All right, then I shall bid you all adieu and Chag Sameach, and enjoy the rest of the evening or the entire night if that's what if you're studying for the whole night with this wonderful program. And hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank
Very
you.
good.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks for sharing. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.